Most people spend their 20s building a career. Jemma Lilley spent hers building a monster. In a sun-bleached backyard in Perth, a crude, fresh patch of concrete sat drying under the Australian heat, a DIY project that looked innocent to an unsuspecting neighbor. But beneath that gray crust lay the first chapter of a manual for murder. Jemma didn't just want to kill, she wanted to create a legacy. She called herself the Maker, and on that June morning, her dark fiction finally bled into reality. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand the calculated brutality that unfolded in the suburbs of Perth, one must first travel nearly 9,000 miles away to the historic stone-lined streets of Stamford, Lincolnshire, England. This was where Jemma Lilley was born in 1991, growing up in a world that felt far too small for the darkness she felt swelling inside her. From a very young age, Jemma wasn't interested in the typical milestones of childhood. While her peers were occupied with schoolyard games and pop culture, she was becoming a dedicated student of the macabre. Her father later recalled a daughter who was obsessed with horror icons, not as a fleeting hobby but as a lifestyle. She didn't just watch movies, she studied them, finding a peculiar, chilling kinship with figures like Freddy Krueger and the Chucky doll. There was a sense of detachment in her, a coldness that seemed to suggest she viewed the world through a different lens, one where empathy was a foreign language. By the time she reached her teenage years, Jemma's interest had curdled into something far more structured. She began writing a book, a sprawling, violent epic she titled The Playzone. In this fictional world, she created a character named SOS, a sadistic serial killer who took pleasure in the meticulous destruction of others. To those around her, it was perhaps just an edgy hobby, a way for a misunderstood girl to vent her frustrations. But for Jemma, the line between the ink on the page and the blood in her veins was beginning to blur. She started referring to herself as SOS. She wasn't just the author, she was becoming the protagonist. She told those in her inner circle that she wanted to commit a murder before she turned 25, not out of passion or desperation, but because she wanted to know what it felt like to be the maker of death. In 2010, looking for a fresh canvas for her dark ambitions, Jemma moved to Western Australia. She settled in Perth, a city known for its isolation and its relentless, scorching sun. The transition from the damp grey of England to the 100-degree Fahrenheit heat of the Australian West did little to thaw her disposition. She found work as a night filler at a Woolworths supermarket in the suburb of Palmyra. It was a job that suited her perfectly, working in the dead of night, moving through the fluorescent-lit aisles while the rest of the world slept. It was here, amidst the hum of industrial refrigerators and the clatter of restocking shelves, that she began to scout for a partner, someone who could help her bridge the gap between her violent fantasies and the physical world. Enter Trudy Lennon. In 2016, Trudy was a 43-year-old mother of three, a woman who, on the surface, appeared to be just another face in the suburban crowd. But Trudy was a woman adrift, harboring her own secret fascinations with the darker side of human interaction. She had a history of involvement in the BDSM community, often taking on submissive roles, seeking a sense of belonging in the shadows of society. When she met Jemma at the supermarket, the chemistry was immediate and toxic. Jemma, with her shaved head, her tattoos, and her unwavering, predatory confidence, was exactly the kind of dominant Trudy had been searching for. Trudy wasn't just a friend, she became a disciple. Jemma quickly recognized that Trudy was the missing piece of her puzzle, a willing tool that could be molded and directed. She introduced Trudy to the world of the Playzone, christening her with the name Corvina. The two women began a relationship that was built on a foundation of mutual depravity. They moved in together at a property in Aurelia, a quiet, unremarkable residential area where the neighbors took pride in their lawns and their privacy. Inside that house, however, the atmosphere was stifling. Jemma had transformed the space into a shrine to her fictional killer, SOS. The walls were adorned with horror memorabilia, and the conversations were dominated by Jemma's desire to ascend to the status of a real-life murderer. Trudy seemed intoxicated by Jemma's vision. She didn't just tolerate the talk of killing, she encouraged it, acting as a sounding board for Jemma's increasingly detailed plans. They weren't just two women sharing a home. They were a murderous duo in the making, waiting for the right moment and the right victim to walk into their trap. Jemma's obsession with the maker persona was reaching a fever pitch. She felt that her life was incomplete without a trophy, without a body to prove that she was more than just a writer of fiction. She needed a project. She needed someone vulnerable, someone who wouldn't be missed immediately, someone who would be easy to overpower in the sanctuary of her Aurelia home. As the months of early 2016 ticked by, the neighbors noticed small things: the way the curtains stayed drawn during the day, the strange, intense energy radiating from the two women when they were seen in the driveway. They were an odd pair, the young, intense Englishwoman with the piercing gaze and the older, seemingly subservient mother. No one could have imagined that beneath the mundane routine of grocery shifts and household chores, a blueprint for a homicide was being finalized. Jemma was checking the calendar, watching the clock. Her 25th birthday was approaching, and she was determined to meet her self-imposed deadline. The exposition of her life was over. She was ready for the rising action, and the quiet streets of Perth were about to become the backdrop for a nightmare that the community would never be able to forget. The house at 94 Broughton Way in Aurelia was a structure of brick and tile that offered no outward clues to the rot festering within its walls. To the postman or the neighbors across the street, it was merely another suburban residence in a working-class neighborhood, a place where the lawn might be a bit dry under the Western Australian sun, but nothing more. Yet, inside, Jemma Lilley had curated a museum of the macabre, a sanctuary where the line between her self-authored fiction and her physical reality had finally dissolved into a singular, poisonous intent. The interior was a cluttered testament to Jemma's lifelong fixation on the mechanics of death. Shelves were lined with horror film figurines, Chucky dolls that seemed to watch with glass eyes, and masks that hung like flayed skin. It was here that Jemma truly shed her identity as a supermarket clerk and fully inhabited the skin of SOS, the protagonist of her violent manuscript, The Playzone. The bond between Jemma and Trudy Lennon was not one of friendship, nor was it a traditional romance. It was a psychological fusion that required a master and a servant. Jemma was the architect, the maker, a woman who possessed a terrifyingly cold clarity about her desires. Trudy, on the other hand, was the vessel. As a 43-year-old mother of three, Trudy had spent years drifting through the fringes of the BDSM community, searching for a dominance that felt absolute, a control that would relieve her of the burden of her own failing life. In Jemma, she found a goddess of darkness. Jemma didn't just want Trudy to clean the house or share her bed. She wanted Trudy to witness her ascension into the pantheon of real-world monsters. She demanded total subservience, eventually formalizing their relationship through a chilling master-slash-slave contract that Trudy signed with a sense of perverse pride. From that moment on, Trudy was no longer a mother or a neighbor. She was Corvina, the loyal acolyte to Jemma's SOS. Their digital communication, later unearthed by forensic investigators, revealed a descent into madness that was as methodical as a blueprint. They didn't speak of mundane chores or financial worries. Their messages were a rolling dialogue of homicidal ideation. Jemma told Trudy that she felt a physical ache, a restless energy that could only be stilled by the act of taking a life. She described the maker not as a killer, but as a creator who used flesh and bone as her medium. Trudy, far from being a reluctant participant, fueled this fire. She validated Jemma's need to kill, assuring her that she would be there to facilitate the project. They began to refer to the act of murder as the event, or the mission. It was a shared secret that isolated them from the rest of the world, creating a feedback loop where the most horrific thoughts were met with encouragement rather than revulsion. By early 2016, the theoretical became logistical. Jemma began to treat their Aurelia home as a staging ground. She took Trudy to local hardware stores, specifically the sprawling Bunnings warehouse, where they walked the aisles with a shopping list that would have paralyzed a normal person with fear. They weren't looking for garden tools or home decor. They were looking for the components of a body disposal kit. They purchased 100-liter plastic tubs, roughly 26-gallon containers that were large enough to hold a human torso. They bought heavy bags of concrete, weighing 44 pounds each, and several gallons of hydrochloric acid. Jemma told Trudy that the acid was a contingency, a way to ensure that if things went wrong, the evidence could be melted away into a slurry of unidentifiable chemicals. In the garage, Jemma began to experiment with the materials, mixing concrete and testing the seals on the plastic tubs, all while Trudy watched with a quiet, unsettling devotion. The final piece of the maker's puzzle was the victim. Jemma was specific about the type of person she required for her first creation. She didn't want to fight. She wanted an easy ascension. She needed someone who was vulnerable, someone whose disappearance might be rationalized by the authorities as a runaway or a mental health crisis. She sought a discardable person, a term that reflected her complete lack of human empathy. Trudy, who worked as a learning assistant at a local college and was integrated into various social circles, became the scout. She suggested several candidates, but Jemma rejected them for being too connected. They needed someone isolated. Their sights eventually settled on 18-year-old Aaron Pajic. Aaron was a young man who lived life on the periphery, navigating the world with the added challenges of autism. He was gentle, trusting, and possessed a childlike enthusiasm for computers and gaming. To Jemma and Trudy, his innocence wasn't a reason for mercy. It was an invitation. They knew Aaron from a local educational support center where Trudy had previously worked. He was a friend of Trudy's son, a connection that gave them the perfect in. Jemma observed that Aaron was a sweet boy, a descriptor that in her mouth sounded like a predator discussing the tenderness of prey. He was exactly what the maker needed, a boy who would follow a friendly face into a dark room without a second thought. As the date for the event drew closer, the atmosphere inside the Aurelia house reached a fever pitch of anticipation. Jemma began to finalize her manuscript, seeing the impending murder as the true final chapter of the Playzone. She wasn't just killing a boy, she was birthing the character of SOS into the physical world. She told Trudy that once the first one was done, the rest would be easier, that they were starting a work that would last for years. They practiced their roles, how they would lure him, where they would stand, how they would ensure he couldn't scream. The M-dashes of their text messages, the pauses between the planning and the execution, were filled with a dark, electric tension. Jemma was 24 years old, and her self-imposed deadline was fast approaching. She had the house, she had the servant, she had the acid, and now she had a name. All that remained was to bring Aaron Paich to 94 Broughton Way and prove to the world that Jemma Lilley was, in fact, the maker. On the morning of June 13, 2016, the winter sun over Perth was thin and cold, casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement of the Rockingham shopping center. For 18-year-old Aaron Paich, it was a day like any other, a day governed by the familiar rhythms of his routine and his unwavering trust in the world around him. Aaron, who lived with his parents and navigated the complexities of life with a gentle spirit and the challenges of autism, had no reason to suspect that he was the focal point of a predatory gaze. He was a boy who found joy in the digital landscapes of computer games, where rules were clear and outcomes were predictable. But on this Monday, he was about to be lured into a game where the rules had been written by a sociopath, and the only possible outcome was his destruction. The hunt began with a simple, deceptive gesture of friendship. Trudy Lennon, the woman Aaron knew as a friendly acquaintance from his time at an educational support center, approached him at the shopping mall. She wasn't a stranger. She was a face he recognized, a bridge to a social world that often felt overwhelming. Trudy told him that she had some computer equipment at her house, software and hardware that a gaming enthusiast like Aaron would find irresistible. It was the perfect bait. To Aaron, it wasn't a suspicious invitation from a middle-aged woman and her younger, intense roommate. It was an opportunity to engage with his passion. He followed Trudy and Jemma Lilley to their car, a silver hatchback that would serve as the carriage to his tomb. As they drove the short distance to the Aurelia property, the atmosphere inside the vehicle was a study in horrific contrast. Aaron sat in the back, likely chatting about technology, his mind filled with the innocent anticipation of a new game. In the front seats, Jemma and Trudy sat in a state of electric, homicidal synchronization. Jemma, at 24, was just days away from her self-imposed deadline. She felt the heavy weight of the knife she had sharpened specifically for this mission. She was no longer Jemma the shelf stacker. She was SOS, the maker, finally on the precipice of her first creation. Trudy, the loyal Corvina, gripped the steering wheel, her submissive devotion to Jemma's dark vision overriding every maternal instinct she had ever possessed. They weren't just driving home, they were transporting a project to the Playzone. When the car pulled into the driveway of 94 Broughton Way, the neighborhood remained blissfully unaware. No one saw the three of them enter the house. Once inside, the trap snapped shut with a clinical, terrifying speed. The interior of the house was a labyrinth of horror memorabilia, but for Aaron, the danger didn't manifest as a monster under the bed. It came from behind. Jemma had prepared the Playzone with the meticulousness of a stage director. She had laid out plastic sheeting in specific areas, a detail she had lifted directly from the pages of her own violent fiction. The air in the house was stale, smelling of dust and the faint, acrid scent of the chemicals they had purchased weeks prior. The transition from hospitality to horror was instantaneous. As Aaron was led into the house, perhaps toward a computer or a room where he expected to find the promised equipment, Jemma made her move. She didn't hesitate. There was no moment of doubt or a flicker of humanity that stayed her hand. She approached Aaron from behind and struck. The initial attack was swift and brutal, designed to incapacitate the boy before he could even comprehend the betrayal. Aaron, caught in a whirlwind of sudden, inexplicable violence, tried to defend himself. His small, frantic movements, the desperate attempts to shield his face or grab at the air, were met with a cold, professional efficiency. Jemma didn't just kill him, she made him. She used a garrote, a weapon she had practiced with in secret, to loop around his neck. The physical struggle was short. Aaron was 18, but he was slight, and the combined force of the two women was overwhelming. As the garrote tightened, the maker watched the life fade from his eyes with a clinical detachment that investigators would later describe as utterly chilling. She wanted to feel the resistance of his body, the vibration of his last breaths through the wire. This was the event she had dreamed of since her childhood in England. This was the moment Jemma Lilley believed she finally became a god, While Erin's body lay cooling on the floor of the room she had prepared, Jemma didn't collapse in a fit of remorse or panic. Instead, she felt a surge of triumphant energy. She later boasted to Trudy that the feeling was better than she ever imagined. But the maker was not yet finished with her work. The creation required a burial, a way to fold the boy into the very foundation of her world. The two women moved the body to the backyard, to a trench they had pre-dug under the guise of a DIY patio project. They worked through the afternoon, the silence of the suburb punctuated only by the scrape of shovels and the heavy thud of concrete bags. They placed Aaron in the shallow grave, a space so cramped he had to be folded into a fetal position to fit. This was the ultimate dehumanization, a young man with dreams and a family reduced to a logistical problem to be solved with mortar and stone. Jemma poured the concrete herself, smoothing the surface with a trowel, ensuring the edges were flush with the existing path. She was meticulous, wanting the patio to look like a legitimate home improvement project. As the gray sludge settled over Aaron, Jemma felt a sense of completion. She had met her deadline. She had her body. She had her monument. That evening, Jemma went to her shift at Woolworths. She stocked the shelves, chatted with coworkers, and moved through the fluorescent aisles with a secret, glowing pride. She was no longer just a night filler. She was a murderer who had successfully hidden her victim in her own backyard. Back at the house, Trudy cleaned the blood. She scrubbed the floors and the walls, disposing of the plastic sheeting and the blood-soaked clothes with a mechanical efficiency. They were SOS and Corvina, bound by blood and concrete. As the sun set on June 13th, the search for Aaron Pyatt began in a world that still believed he had simply lost track of time. His parents, worried when he didn't return home, started making calls. They visited the shopping center, they spoke to his friends, they contacted the police. They had no idea that their son was already becoming a permanent part of a house only a few miles away. Jemma Lilley had finished her first chapter, and as she worked her shift, she was already dreaming of the next project. The maker was just getting started, and the concrete in Aurelia was already beginning to harden over the secret of Broughton Way. The texture of the ground, the smell of the wet cement. These were the sensory anchors of a crime that defied the peaceful expectations of a Perth winter. The hunt was over, the event was complete, and the silence of the grave was the only sound left in the Playzone. When the clock on the wall of the Pyatt home ticked past 6 p.m. on June 13th, the air in the room didn't just grow colder, it grew heavier. For Keith and Veronica Pyatt, time was usually a comforting, predictable sequence of events, especially where Aaron was concerned. Their 18-year-old son lived in a world of precise schedules, a necessity for a young man navigating the sensory complexities of autism. He didn't wander. He didn't forget. He didn't simply stay out late. When the evening shadows stretched across their Kwinana neighborhood and Aaron's seat at the table remained empty, the silence in the house became deafening. It was a silence that signaled the beginning of the void, a week of agonizing uncertainty where a family's life would be consumed by the search for a boy who had vanished into the cracks of a suburban nightmare. The initial hours were spent in a frantic, localized ritual of denial. Keith and Veronica told themselves that perhaps he had been caught up in a game, or maybe he had missed his bus from the Rockingham shopping center, which sat about 5 miles away from their front door. They drove the familiar route, their eyes scanning the sidewalks and bus stops, hoping to see Aaron's familiar, slight frame and his distinctive, gentle gait. They checked the mall, walking the brightly lit corridors, where the scent of floor wax and fast food usually offered a sense of normalcy. They spoke to security guards, describing a boy with a kind face and a trusting nature, but the answers were always the same. No one had seen him. The void was already expanding, swallowing the breadcrumbs of his existence. By the time the sun rose on June 14th, the search had shifted from a private family crisis to a matter for the Western Australia Police. Because of Aaron's vulnerability, the authorities didn't apply the usual 24-hour waiting period often associated with adult disappearances. He was classified as a high-risk missing person. The investigators told the family they were doing everything possible. But to Keith and Veronica, everything felt like nothing as long as Aaron was gone. The police began the painstaking process of retracing his steps, a task that felt like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. They looked into his digital life, checking his gaming accounts and social media, searching for a name, a message, or a meeting that could explain his departure. The community reaction was immediate and visceral. In the close-knit suburbs of Perth's south, the disappearance of a vulnerable young man like Aaron Pyatt felt like an assault on the collective safety of every family. Rumors began to circulate, the dark, jagged whispers that filled the vacuum of information. Some suggested he might have been lured away by someone he met online. Others feared he had simply become overwhelmed and wandered into the dense bushland that bordered the residential areas. The fear was a cold, creeping thing that changed the atmosphere of the local parks and shopping centers. Parents held their children a little tighter, and the quiet streets of Aurelia and Kwinana felt suddenly watched, as if the shadows themselves were predatory. While the public searched the streets, the police were hitting the first of many frustrating dead ends, the red herrings that define a stalled investigation. A reported sighting of a boy matching Aaron's description at a train station nearly 20 miles away sent a team of officers racing to review grainy CCTV footage, only to find a stranger who bore a fleeting resemblance to the missing teen. Another tip suggested he had been seen walking toward the beach, sparking a localized search of the coastline that turned up nothing but sea foam and empty sand. Each false lead was a blow to the family's morale, a moment of fleeting hope followed by a deeper, more profound despair. The void wasn't just empty, it was cruel. Through all of this, the house at 94 Broughton Way remained a fortress of chilling silence. Only a few blocks away from where search parties were combing the tall grass and knocking on doors, Jemma Lilley and Trudy Lennon were living in the aftermath of their creation. Investigators would later reflect on the staggering irony of those days, how the perpetrators watched the news, perhaps even seeing the tearful appeals from Aaron's parents, while the concrete in their backyard was still curing. Jemma told Trudy that they needed to remain normal, a directive that resulted in a performance of suburban mundanity that was almost as horrific as the crime itself. They went to work, they bought groceries, and they moved through the world as if they hadn't just folded a human being into the earth. The psychological toll on the Podgich family during this period was immeasurable. Veronica told the media that her son was a sweet, sweet boy who wouldn't know how to defend himself against the darkness of the world. She spoke in the present tense, clinging to the hope that he was simply lost or being held somewhere, unable to call home. The family's house became a command center, filled with posters, maps, and the constant, jarring ring of the telephone. Every time the door opened, there was a split second of expectation, the belief that Aaron would walk through and apologize for being late, before the reality of the void crashed down again. As the search entered its 5th day, the focus began to sharpen. The detectives moved past the red herrings and began to look more closely at Aaron's last known contacts. They discovered that he had been seen at the mall with 2 women, one older, one younger. The bridge between the missing boy and the house in Aurelia was finally beginning to form, but it was a bridge made of digital shadows and half-remembered faces. The investigation was about to shift from the streets to the screens as the void finally began to yield its secrets. The silence of the Aurelia house was about to be broken, not by Aaron's voice, but by the heavy tread of the tactical response group. The search was nearing its end, and the Maker was about to find that the world she had tried to create was crumbling around her. The sensory anchors of the search, the smell of rain on hot asphalt, the sight of a blue hoodie in a thrift store window, would haunt the family for years, a reminder of the week the world stopped making sense. The wall of silence surrounding Aaron Podgich's disappearance didn't shatter all at once. It began to crack under the flickering, fluorescent glow of a security monitor. While the community was out combing the bushland, detectives were sitting in a darkened room at the Rockingham police station, their eyes strained by hours of grainy, low-resolution CCTV footage from the shopping center. It was here that the first real breadcrumb appeared. On the screen, a slight figure, Aaron, could be seen walking with purpose. He wasn't alone. He was flanked by 2 women. One was older, walking with a slight stoop, and the other was younger, her movements sharp, almost military in their precision. They looked like a family or perhaps a group of friends, but to the trained eyes of the major crime squad, something about the grouping felt off. The younger woman, later identified as Jemma Lilley, was wearing her Woolworth's work uniform, a mundane, everyday detail that made her presence alongside the missing boy feel even more predatory. By June 19th, nearly a week after Aaron was last seen, the digital trail led the authorities directly to the doorstep of Trudy Lennon. Because Trudy had been a teaching assistant at the same college Aaron attended, the connection was initially viewed through a lens of tragic possibility. Perhaps she had seen him and was trying to help. But when detectives began to dig into the relationship between Trudy and her roommate, the narrative shifted from a missing person case to something far more sinister. They discovered that Jemma Lilley wasn't just a shelf stacker. She was a woman obsessed with a self-created myth. A search of their digital footprints revealed a world of SOS and Corvina, a master and a servant, bound by a contract that spoke of absolute control and blood. The cracks were no longer just procedural, they were psychological. The investigation moved with a sudden, localized intensity toward the hardware stores of Perth. Detectives began canvassing the local Bunnings warehouses, looking for any recent, unusual purchases made by the residents of 94 Broughton Way. What they found was a logistical nightmare. CCTV footage from the store showed Jemma Lilley still in her work clothes, pushing a trolley laden with 44-pound bags of concrete and several large 100-liter plastic tubs. This wasn't a woman planning a weekend garden renovation. This was a woman purchasing the raw materials for a tomb. The receipts showed that these items, along with several gallons of high-strength hydrochloric acid, had been bought weeks before Aaron disappeared. The premeditation was no longer a theory. It was documented in black and white on thermal paper. On June 20th, 2016, the quiet of Broughton Way was decimated by the arrival of the Tactical Response Group. Neighbors watched from behind their curtains as officers in blue forensic suits and tactical gear swarmed the property. The atmosphere inside the house was described by investigators as stifling, a claustrophobic mix of childhood innocence and calculated depravity. In one room, there were toys belonging to Trudy's children. In another, the walls were a shrine to Jemma's Playzone, filled with knives, horror masks, and the chilling manuscript of her book. The air didn't smell like a typical home. It smelled of heavy-duty cleaning agents, bleach, and industrial soaps used in a desperate, late-night attempt to erase the event that had occurred only days prior. While Jemma Lilley sat in an interrogation room, her expression one of arrogant, cold amusement, forensic teams began the grueling work of dissecting the backyard. They noticed a patch of concrete that looked amateurish, a DIY patio that was roughly 10 feet long and sat tucked away in a corner of the lot. It was fresh, the gray surface still showing the swirl marks of a trowel and the slight, uneven settling of a hurried job. The detectives called in a specialized team to begin the excavation. The sound of the jackhammer echoed through the suburb, a rhythmic, jarring noise that seemed to mark the seconds until the truth was unearthed. As the top layer of concrete was chipped away, the tension on the scene became unbearable. The forensic officers moved from power tools to hand trowels, carefully brushing away the dirt and mortar. About 18 inches down, they hit something that wasn't rock or soil. It was plastic. A heavy, dark tarp had been used to wrap a large object. The smell that began to rise from the trench was one that no investigator ever forgets. The sweet, cloying scent of decay mixed with the acrid, chemical bite of the surrounding soil. They had found the void. Inside the tarp, folded into a fetal position to fit the cramped space of the trench, was Aaron Podgich. He was still wearing the clothes his parents had last seen him in. The sight of his slight frame, discarded like trash beneath a cheap patio, brought a grim, heavy silence to the backyard. The red herrings of the previous week, the sightings at the train station, the theories about him wandering off, evaporated in the face of this physical reality. The investigation now turned to the forensic minutiae of the house. Inside, detectives found a computer that contained the digital soul of the crime. They recovered deleted files of the Playzone, discovering that Jemma had been documenting her desire to kill for years. They found the master-slave contract, a document that stripped Trudy Lennon of her humanity and turned her into a weapon for the Maker. Most chillingly, they found a series of messages sent by Jemma to a friend in the UK shortly after the murder. In them, she didn't express fear of being caught. She expressed a sense of ascension. She told her friend that she was seeing things she had never seen and that she felt full for the first time in her life. The interrogation of Jemma Lilley was a study in sociopathic detachment. She didn't cry. She didn't ask about Aaron. She spoke about her book as if it were a masterpiece and viewed the detectives not as figures of authority, but as an audience for her brilliance. She claimed that the concrete was just a project she hadn't finished and that she had no idea how a body had ended up in her yard. Her arrogance was a shield, but the cracks in her story were too wide to ignore. Trudy Lennon, however, was beginning to crumble. The Corvina persona was fading, replaced by a woman who realized that her dominant had led her into a life sentence. The submissive acolyte was starting to talk, her fear of the law finally outweighing her devotion to the Maker. The final piece of forensic evidence came from the autopsy. It confirmed that Aaron had been strangled with a garrote and stabbed multiple times, a level of violence that spoke to a deep, visceral hatred that Jemma Lilley had harbored for a boy she barely knew. There were traces of the concrete dust in his hair, a sign that he had been placed in the ground while the mortar was still wet. The Maker hadn't just taken his life. She had attempted to erase him from the world entirely, turning him into a structural component of her home. As the sun set on the Aurelia property on the final day of the search, the cracks in the case had become a chasm that would eventually swallow Jemma Lilley and Trudy Lennon whole. The investigation was over, the body had been recovered, and the Playzone was now a crime scene that would forever haunt the memory of Western Australia. The sound of the trowel against the stone, the cold blue of the forensic lights, these were the sensory anchors of a truth that could no longer be hidden. The trial in the Supreme Court of Western Australia was a clinical descent into a specific kind of suburban hell. Jemma Lilley sat in the dock, frequently smirking, or appearing bored as the prosecution meticulously laid out the anatomy of her obsession. Her own father, flown in from England, took the stand and told the court that he believed his daughter was indeed a sociopath, an admission that felt like a final, tragic seal on her soul. The defense attempted to paint Trudy Lennon as the primary manipulator, but the digital trail of SOS and Corvina was undeniable. The jury didn't see two women who had simply lost their way. They saw two predators who had fulfilled a murderous contract. In late 2017, the verdict was delivered guilty. The judge described Lilley as a narcissistic, cold-blooded killer who had sacrificed a vulnerable boy to satisfy a dark ego. Both were sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 28 years. Lilley didn't look at the Pajic family as she was led away. She simply stared ahead. The house on Broughton Way has new tenants now, the grass grown over the spot where Aaron once lay, but the memory of the maker remains a cold stain on the heart of Perth. Jemma Lilley didn't just write a book, she tore a hole in the fabric of a family that can never be mended. Aaron Pajic wasn't a character in a Playzone. He was a gentle soul stolen for a narcissist's final chapter. Jemma's legacy isn't creation, but hollow destruction. The concrete has hardened, but the pain is still wet. If you are finished watching, you're a real true crime fan. Subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. See you in the next video.